we can. What I would say is that I've yet to do one of these sessions where there wasn't some question somebody comes up with that I have to say we'll take away and get back to you on, because there's always something you haven't thought of or haven't come across before, particularly in the world of packaging, where there are an ever-growing number of unusual products, innovative products, and so on that we have to think about. So we will endeavour to answer as many of your questions as we can, but we may have to take them away in one or two cases and get back to you. So that's a overview of what we will cover. The tax at a glance, and what I would emphasize from the outset, because I think this is important to keep in mind when dealing with technical questions about the operation of the tax and how we administer it and so on, is that this tax is not about raising revenue. It's not like income tax, which is there to provide funds for the government to spend on public services. This tax is aimed at changing behaviour. It's aimed at encouraging the use of recycled plastic instead of virgin plastic material in packaging. So when you take that in mind, in terms of thinking about how businesses comply and so on, there can be a temptation and so on just to assume that none of the packaging is recycled, so we'll just pay tax on the whole weight, for example. But if you do that takes away from the environmental aim, because it removes the incentive to use recycled material. So if we keep in mind at all times the objective of the tax is to improve the proportion of recycled plastic in use in packaging, and see how that frames some of the questions and the issues that we face, that can be quite helpful, rather than just thinking purely about the money being raised from the tax. We know already that recycling capacity in some areas has started to increase in the UK, even when the tax was announced before it came into play. And we hope that the tax will continue to drive innovation in recycling and lead to recycled material being used in new areas and in products perhaps where it's not so much at the moment. So what is in scope of the tax? You see there are two key definitions, two types of plastic packaging that fall within the scope of the tax. It's packaging components used within the supply chain, so any time from the product being made to delivered to the consumer. And it's also single-use packaging used in the home, so things like nappy sacks, disposable cups. What I would say on that first definition, the supply chain, is that it's not automatically just single-use packaging. It's not a single-use plastics tax, it's a tax on packaging. So some packaging that can be reused is within scope of the tax. To determine whether something is plastic for the purpose of the tax, if there's more than one material used in the packaging component, you look at the weights of the plastic and of the other materials used against a list that's in our guidance. If there is more plastic by weight than any other material, single material, then the component is treated as plastic for the purpose of the tax. The other thing to bear in mind is that individual packaging components are taxed separately. So you have to think a bit differently. If you have a plastic drinks bottle, the bottle itself would be one component, the lid would be another component, and the label would be a third component. We have to assess components separately for the tax. So here are some examples of things that are in the tax. You see a drinks bottle there, as I've discussed, a plastic carrier bag, cling film. The orange juice carton is an interesting one because that would be a multi-material packaging. It's made of cardboard with a plastic coating. So in that case, you'd have to assess if the plastic or the cardboard weighed the most in that container. Almost certainly the cardboard. So if that was the case, it wouldn't be classed as plastic and therefore not subject to the tax. The lid would be plastic though, and that would be taxed separately as a separate component. There's also a plastic pallet there. Now, we are aware of issues with reusable supply chain packaging such as pallets and crates that come in and out of the country constantly, filled with all sorts of products and produce and so on. And there is an issue with tracking those and the importer being able to claim the credit for when they're exported and so on. They are in scope of the tax, but we are urgently looking at that question and trying to reach a solution to prevent huge amounts of administration in connection with those types of packaging. So what isn't taxed? And there are two groups here. The first 6 items that we see there are things that are completely outside the scope of the tax. So you just don't take them into account in the tax, in anything to do with the tax at all. Transport packaging used to import goods. Now, this is additional packaging that's added to goods to protect them through the import process. So if you had a stack of boxes on a pallet and they were wrapped in film for the import process, the film would count as transport packaging or be outside the scope of the tax. The normal packaging that was already with the goods would not be exempt, though. Packaging manufactured or imported for non-commercial purposes. So, for example, if the National Health Service were to directly import some surgical instruments, say, from outside the UK themselves, then the packaging on those would not be subject to the tax because they were not being used commercially. Packaging which is integral to the product, and we'll give some examples of that shortly, but it's things where the packaging also performs a function in the use and delivery of the product. Items where packaging is secondary to a storage function, that's things like toolboxes and so on. Packaging primarily designed to be reused for the presentation of goods, then this is really talking about shop fittings, shop shelves and racks and so on. And packaging used in aircraft, ships or railway stores on international journeys. So that's the things that are in the shops on board, and also supplies perhaps for, excuse me, fixing the boat or the plane or the train that you're on that they might carry. The bottom 3 items aren't taxed, but you would still need to keep records of and report them on your return. That's immediate packaging for licensed human medicines. So that's just the bit that touches the medicine itself. Packaging that is exported, and packaging containing at least 30% or more recycled plastic as a proportion of all the plastic in the packaging, which is really what we'd like people to do. Is that a question?
Sorry, yeah, the question mark was around whether the presentation is being recorded and will be made available to refer back to, and I assume the answer to that is yes. Well, actually, I don't assume the answer to that is yes. What is the answer to that?
We're happy to have it recorded and be available. I think I saw a thing saying it's being recorded. So
yes,
yes, the session is being recorded, and everyone will receive a copy once it's been uploaded onto the platform.
Excellent. Yeah, because it's useful to have the slides as well. We'll probably do the slides separately if that's possible. Do them as a PDF because people like to go through those one by one.
Absolutely, yes. We'll make sure you get those. Okay.
So keep asking your questions, folks. It'll give Mark a chance to have a drink of water or something.
Yes, it gets very boring for me if nobody asks questions. So please do join in.
Mark, can I just ask a question straight off there then? Because I noticed that the non-commercial purpose. Is that something that's developed over time? I know there was an exclusion on direct use for a medicine, wasn't there? But looks like that's expanded a little.
No, it's always been there as far as I know. I mean, it's always been a tax on packaging that's imported for commercial purposes. And I think that perhaps people didn't fully appreciate what that means. But I mean, the best example I can think of, because I was asked this a couple of days ago, is the NHS importing things directly. If they were imported by a supplier and then sold to the NHS, that would be commercial. But if they directly imported by the NHS, they're not a commercial entity, so they would be exempt.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to look at just a little bit more detail in some of those exemptions to give some examples. Packaging integral to the product, and this is an interesting one because we've had lots and lots of people claiming that their packaging is integral to the product and you can't use the product without it and so on. The basic test here is the packaging has to provide a function beyond protecting and carrying and holding the contents. So you see the asthma inhaler, the printer cartridge and so on, because they actually play a part in how the content is delivered. You don't just take it out as you might take a ready meal out of its tray, for example, and so on, or something like that. Almost all packaging has to keep something in a certain condition and protect it and so on. That's not enough to classify it as integral. It has to play a role in the actual way that the product is delivered. So the contents of an asthma inhaler or a printer cartridge would be extremely difficult to remove and use without that holder. If you look at it that way, it makes more sense. Now, for this exemption, for all the exemptions, in fact, on the guidance, there is a list of things that are covered and a list of things that aren't covered. Now, we can never be exhaustive with that, of course, because there's an almost infinite number of different packaging components out there and things that people want advice on. So what we're trying to do is put as many things on there as we can. If you can't see the item that you're interested in, try and draw a parallel. What's the closest thing, and see whether it's on the list of things that are in scope or out of scope of the tax.
Something that might be of interest there, Mark, is the cartridges that are used for sealants.
Right, yes.
Silicon, for example. So where would that fit?
Where that would fit, I would have to look up myself, I'm afraid. All
right, we can come back to it.
We can come back to that, yeah. We'll get back to, I know that's come up before, and I'm sorry, I honestly can't remember off the top of my head which side it is, but I will have a look for that in a second. There's some more questions there. I'm sorry, I can only see a number. I can't see the actual questions.
Yeah, the question from Sarah asking where can the list of items that are exempt be found? Because that's obviously a very useful thing for people to get to. Perhaps we can find a link for that.
Yeah, it's in. If you search for plastic packaging tax on gov.uk, all the guidance is there, including that list.
Excellent, thank you. And another one from Narendra saying, does it make any difference if the plastic components... Questions coming thick and fast already, Mark.
Okay, that's great. Go for it.
Yeah. Does it make any difference if the plastic components in the packaging are made from recycled or recyclable plastic in terms of the scope or out of scope aspect?
Recycled, absolutely, and that's the whole essence of the tax. And if the plastic component, packaging component, contains at least 30% recycled plastic, then there's no tax on it, but you will still have to report the weight on your tax return if you have to register. Recyclable, no, that doesn't have an impact on the tax, because almost all plastic can be claimed to be recyclable. It's whether it's actually made from recycled plastic in the first place that's the issue for the tax.
Yeah, nice example. And Sarah's come back and said that HMRC have confirmed that cartridges are integral to products and so exempt. So that's the
right, well, there we go. Yeah.
But the nozzles are out. The nozzles that go on the cartridges are out of scope and so perform a packaging function, which is interesting.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, but I understand, because the cartridge has that sort of flexible base, and you couldn't really take all the sealant out of one of those cartridges and use it readily just out of a plate or out of another tub or something. So if that's what we've said, that's great. You will understand there are so many different things we've been asked about over the last couple of years that keeping them all in your head for an aging head like mine is extremely challenging, but that's good. Your audience are ahead of us.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, that's what we hope for.
Yeah.
Keep going. Thank you.
Keep going. Okay. Some examples here of storage products. Now, these are products where the packaging is secondary to the storage function. So they are things that you would keep with the item inside for the life of that item, or even refill. So things like a glasses case, a first aid kit, a toolbox, or a drill box. Every time you buy a drill now, it seems to come with a plastic box that you keep it and the piece and the drill bits and so on in. That is for storing the item. So again, it wouldn't be classed as packaging for the purpose of the tax. It's things that accompany the item for the life of it, but it's not things that you use in the inside and throw away. So I think something like a margarine pot wouldn't be included in this exemption. It's for things that are for long-term storage. And products for presentation of goods. This one is a bit easier, I like to think, anyway. And as I say, it's shop fittings, it's shop shelves and display racks and things of that type that stay in the shop and are just replenished with different types of goods for sale.
Mark, this is an interesting one because I think it was our very first or second seminar or webinar that we did with you. This came up as a question, which was taken away and researched, and as a consequence, there were some changes made to the rules that you were applying. So it just tells the audience that there's a listening process going on here, and thinking about the practicalities of how to apply this tax, and that in some small way, the school has made a change to that set of rules.
Absolutely, and that's fantastic, and thank you for your help with that. I mean, I would say we do like to listen, we do try to listen. The fact that we don't always take on board everything that's said to us doesn't mean we're not listening and we don't want to hear it. And sometimes what may seem like a very simple solution from the outside isn't anything like that simple on the inside, and particularly when it comes to exemptions and exclusions, because you'll understand what we have to be very careful of if we're exempting something or excluding something is that we don't take out a whole load of other items as well at the same time that we want to be included in the tax. So yes, that this was a good example that was pointed out to us that could cause an issue and that we've been able to exempt. But yeah, it's a difficult area because however we draw the lines, there is always something that falls squarely on the line, and we then have to decide which side to put it.
But thanks, Mark. There's a further question which I think you might be picking up on down the line, but it's up to you. You handle it, and that's from Narinder, and it says, is it the importer that is responsible, or is it the company or business that is supplying the end user? This is obviously important, isn't it, in terms of the responsibilities?
It is. So for imported packaging, it is the business on whose behalf the goods are imported. So that's normally the named consignee, unless the consignee is just acting as an agent for somebody. So it's basically whoever owns the goods at the time they're imported, and clear customs procedures is the way to look at it. If you use Incoterms, you need to make sure that you're absolutely clear between you and the other business involved who is responsible for the tax and who owns them at the time of import under those terms. Obviously, there's a myriad of different terms for doing business that we don't get involved in the detail of, but it's whoever is in control of the goods and on whose behalf they are imported that is responsible for the tax.
Thank you.
And there you go. That's exactly the point we've just been making. So that the tax is charged when either the packaging is manufactured or finished in the UK, and we'll say a bit more about being finished, or when it's imported finished. And as I say, it's the importer that is responsible. Manufacturing is considered finished if it's undergone its last substantial modification, or if the last substantial modification happens during pack filling, then the last substantial modification before that. So sometimes you get bags that are formed around fresh salad, for example. That's at the same time as pack filling, so it will be the substantial modification before that when the tax becomes due. So the obvious question there is, what is a substantial modification? A substantial modification is a change to the form of the packaging. And there is details in the guidance that we may come on to later about what exactly are and are not substantial modifications. So it's important that you talk to other businesses in the supply chain to make sure you know who is carrying out that last substantial modification before pack filling and who will be responsible for paying the tax. Taxpayer responsibilities. There is a 10-ton threshold before you need to register for the tax. You need to register for the tax if you will be importing or manufacturing a total of 10 tons in the next 30 days, or have done so in the last 12 months or back to the 1st of April this year when the tax started. You don't need to look back past the 1st of April this year, but once we get a year into the tax, you will look back over the last 12 months, and as soon as you've imported or manufactured over 10 tons in the last 12 months at the end of a month, you need to register from the first day of the following month. On any day, if you realize that you're going to import or manufacture over 10 tons in the next 30 days, if you take a big order, for example, then you need to register immediately from that date.
Another question for you, and it's a tricksy one around labelling and printing from Sarah. Is it possible to clarify printing classes as a substantial modification? Is printing a batch number on a pre-printed plastic label considered a substantial modification?
Probably not. No, it's printing in general is a substantial modification. It's the whole label being printed. Just adding a use by date or a batch number, it isn't. It would be the printing of the label itself that would be the last substantial modification. It's anything that changes the weight, but printing a batch number or so on is going to be so minuscule. But again,
it's an important one in terms of how materials are handled, isn't it? So,
absolutely, yes, yeah.
Excellent. Hopefully that answers your question, Sarah. If not, just fire us another question. We'll keep going as long as the time we've got.
So just to finish this slide, companies in the same control can register as a group. Once you're registered, you must put in a tax return every quarter. We'll look at returns a little bit later because their first ones are just going in at the moment. And as soon as you're registered, you have to keep records of all your packaging, and there are details there and details in the guidance. The final thing I will talk about is there was originally a requirement to put on your invoices to business customers details of plastic packaging tax you paid on the goods that you're supplying. That's not been started yet because we received feedback that businesses wouldn't be able to make the changes for that in time. We're at the moment working with our industry working group to see what form that will take, and we'll make an announcement on that plenty of time before it becomes a requirement and give businesses plenty of time to make any IT changes and so on. But we're very much working with business to make that business friendly. What we want to do is increase the transparency of the tax so people know when it's being paid, and they have the option then to switch to recycled alternatives or ask for recycled material to be used in the packaging instead. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Hilary.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello, everybody. Mark just touched on the the responsibility to register. So we basically have two registration conditions, if you like. So we have our forward look test. So if at any time after the 1st of April you expect to manufacture or import at least 10 tonnes in the next 30 days. So give you an example there, on the 7th of April, I get an order for 12 tonnes of plastic wrap to be delivered within the next 3 weeks. So I anticipate I've got that expectation, and that is all it needs to be, is an expectation. And I would register from the 7th of April. If that order fell through, or I didn't deliver it within that 3-week time span, it doesn't actually matter. The sort of expectation to register is still there. So that would be the liable start date. For some businesses, they're never going to meet that forward look condition, perhaps because they're manufacturing or importing practices are different. So to capture the sort of registration for those businesses is where we have the backward look test. So you would look back in the last 12 months. Obviously for this year, it's just to the 1st of April 22. And when you've exceeded 10 tonnes, you would then register from the first day of the following month. So a quick example there is you're a manufacturer of plastic. In April, you manufacture 4 tonnes. May, you manufacture 2 tonnes. And in June you manufacture 4. So you've completed 10 tonnes there. You reach that threshold in the month of June, and you would register from the 1st of July. And if that does apply to you, when you go on the registration service, if you need to, it will ask you similar sorts of questions, and it will tell you what your registration date should be. Thanks, Mark. Mark talked about, some of the evidence that you would need to keep in record keeping. Now, we give quite a few examples and guidance of the sort of things you'd want to keep to determine, which plastic was have more than 30% recycled content, that sort of thing. I would say, it is around due diligence. The business does need to be satisfied that what it's putting on its return and what it's being told by potential suppliers is correct. If you're being offered recycled plastic that's 50% recycled and it's unreasonably cheap or something, you would have some doubts there. So we do put this onus on a business to, really be satisfied with their record keeping and what they're putting on their returns. But obviously, we can help businesses with any of that if they have any questions. But like I say, we're not saying you have to have A, B, C, and D. It's really much a body of evidence about what you're declaring on your return. I take it there's no questions yet. Mark again touched on substantial modification. So we do have a lot of businesses, inquiring, am I doing it, or is my supplier doing less substantial modification? Because it really matters in terms of who needs to register and who needs to account. So we say it's about the shape, the structure, the thickness, or the weight. We obviously just mentioned printing. I think, a sell-by date or whatever is unlikely to increase that weight. The legislation doesn't provide for an actual amount of weight, but I think we're going to be pretty pragmatic about it as long as businesses sort of don't just extend barriers, I suppose, and boundaries on that one. Shape is things like, moving it into a bag or something like that. So there's a few, I believe in the guidance, a few examples of what that is.
Hilary, is there anything to say there about cutting, sort of cutting material into smaller sizes?
Yeah, that's not considered one. I think the next slide goes on to say what isn't substantial modification, but essentially you've got a roll of plastic, you cut it up, it's still a roll of plastic, it's just a bit smaller. So yeah. So here we have the exceptions. So blowing or forming from a preform. So you've got those bottles which just get blown up. It's still the same thing, really. Cutting, labelling and sealing again. We do say, because the sort of tax point arises at that last substantial modification, if you're a business who does a number of substantial modifications, but then you are making the finished product, it is when you've done that final substantial modification as to when it's manufactured, so to speak. Okay, we've had quite a few queries on waste. So we don't treat waste as a plastic packaging component. So anything wasted in the factory or whatever beforehand doesn't have to have tax counted for it. If you as a business are buying some plastic components from a business and you know how much waste you're going to have, you might have 10%, and it's a sort of verifiable system that you're doing, and you always have 5% waste or whatever. If you can provide that evidence to that business who's supplying you, and then they're satisfied as well, then that would not be taxed either. But if there's any waste created afterwards which you didn't know about, your supplier didn't know about, there isn't a relief, so there's no sort of way back. So as Mark mentioned earlier, it's really good for supply chains of businesses to really talk to each other, so as not to sort of overburden things and pay more tax than is necessary. Okay, we also mentioned recycled plastic earlier. It has to be plastic waste that's recycled, so and not organic stuff or made out of some other thing. It's got to be recycled plastic. We've talked about what counts as recycled plastic in our guidance. In some manufacturing processes, there is waste created in the manufacturing process. If that's just simply melted and put straight back into the same process, same manufacturing process, we don't count that as recycled. It has to got to go away to it might be on site, but it has to go away to a sort of reprocessing machine or whatever the terminology is. Yes, so there are certain rules around that, which I think is fairly well set out in our guidance. Just checking there's no questions. Okay, so on exports, obviously to protect businesses and competition and all that sort of thing, if a manufacturer knows they're going to export something directly when they've manufactured it, they will need to report that on their return, but they won't have to pay any tax on it. Similarly, if they sold it to company B and then company B exported it, they would be able to claim a tax credit. So they would have to provide that evidence that it's been exported. And again, this is something that would go on the tax return as well. But it does mean that, all exports, as long as they can be evidenced, will not be subject to the tax. And then transport packaging is just transport packaging, and it's not exported in terms of being exempt from the tax.
Laurie, you have a question.
Yes,
from Tony. Tony Gordon says, we buy tubed packaging that arrives flat. When we fill the tube with our product and then seal both ends to form a bag, is this classed as a significant modification?
I suppose it's a bit like a preform?
It's one you can pick up afterwards if you like.
Yeah,
but it's an interesting case in point, isn't it? Because
yeah. I mean, if it's aligned to sort of a preform and you're just blowing it up, I'd probably say not. But and that's imported packaging. But we'll take that away, Mark. That's fine.
Yeah. So we'll give you a more substantive answer afterwards, Tony.
Sorry about that, Tony.
That's all right. I know. It's hard enough doing the presentations without thinking on the hoof at times. So we empathise on that one.
I mean, if they're importing it anyway, Tony, then you either are or aren't finishing it, but you'd still be the responsible party for accounting for any tax there. But yeah, we'll come back. As Mark mentioned, first returns are now due in. The submission deadline for both payment and submitting the return is the 29th of July. So it's always the last working day of the following month after the accounting period. So there's just some dates set out there as to when the next ones will be due. We've had quite a number of returns in already, and quite a number of returns in early. So that all seems to be going okay. We've had a few, as with any new IT issue, we've had a few sort of queries from businesses unable to do something. So we are going directly back to those businesses. Our IT team are dealing with those to make sure the customer can do what it wants to do. Okay, and so on the return, we talk about those. I'm not going to read them all out, but all the entries there that you would need to have to hand in order to fill out your plastic packaging tax return. So when we say the total weight of plastic packaging components, so you would add up all of your components, so whatever you've imported, and whatever the import is the second one, but whatever you've manufactured. Now, in terms of weight, we do say you can round it down to the nearest kilo. But that was after you've added everything together. So you wouldn't have one sort of component and round that down another sort. So you would take the totality of everything. Same goes with imports, the total weight of that. Entry 3 there is just what I talked about in terms of being exempt from the tax, the exports. And then obviously we have a couple of exemptions there for human medicines that are licensed and not exported. Because those are exempt from tax, as is any plastic containing more than 30% recycled plastic. If you had some plastic that was both human medicine plastic and it had more than 30%, we would just suggest you use one or the other. It doesn't really matter, but we just don't want you to double count anything on that score. And then there's total finished packaging components you've accounted for in a previous return. So obviously the second return will have that functionality. So it'll be about tax you've declared in the first period. And then you find out that that has been perhaps later converted into other packaging because it's been substantially modified or it's been exported, and you can claim a credit for that.
Sarah, Hilary, just before you move on, Sarah's raised a point which is I think of general interest. She says it's a good question, re the flat packaging that is then filled. This would also apply to sealant, sausages, foils, which are purchased empty and then filled and sealed. Most foils have a plastic lining, which is actually more than 50% by weight of the packaging.
Okay, it depends whether it's composite material or not, though. I think.
Yeah.
With the foil.
Yeah. So I think what we've got there is we can maybe pick that one up later on as well. Just as a point of interest, we got several nuances for the built environment. Yeah.
I can see. Oh, sorry, I can see the question actually. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, if it's filled at the time of pack filling, I think is the thing. Is where the distinction is for the last substantial modification. Is where the distinction is, but we can come back if you need us to on that one. Just picking up on the rest of the returns then. So the system will work it out for you. So once you put your numbers in, it will tell you how much you owe potentially to HMRC. There is a declaration, obviously, that everything's true and to the best of our knowledge. There's a lot of companies who import stuff who are finding it difficult or challenging to actually identify the weight of some of the fill packaging because there's so many units. We do understand this, and we're aware that businesses are really trying to do all they can to get to the right figure. If it comes later down the line that actually we were pretty way off on these weights for that first return, you can go back and adjust that return. You have up to 4 years to do that. We'd obviously encourage businesses to do that as soon as they know, but we do recognise that there are challenges around some of this. And then there's just a bit about payment there. We've also got some guidance online about payment as well. I'm not sure how much left there is. So I think all the rest of the slides here, Mark, I understand, are basically links. And if we send you the slide pack, you'll obviously have links to all of those. So we have a number of webinars if you really want to sit through it again. But taking a different tack, it does go into more about weighing stuff, whatever. So the link there would take you to all the webinars that we've had. We had one recently on returns in particular. We've got some technical ones, and we've got some very basic ones. But obviously participants can use them at their leisure should they wish to. And I think that's essentially it, unless you've got any more questions.
No, that's fantastic. But, you know, maybe raise a few points. Obviously, I don't know where July's gone, but we're well into it already. What should businesses that are unsure be doing now? Who are on this call?
I would say have a look at the guidance. We would encourage people to look at the guidance first. If they don't understand it, there are 2 routes through which they can contact HMRC. There's this email address at the bottom here, Indirect Tax Design. That's the team that Mark and I work in, and it will get picked up by one of the team. I would say most of the issues we have from businesses is around scope of a product. Is it packaging or isn't it packaging? And again, as Mark mentioned before, there's a long list in the guidance as to what we think is in and out of scope, which can help businesses decide. But yeah, they can use that email should they have any, want reassurance.
Thanks for that, Hilary. A couple of, Sarah, thanks you for a really useful webinar. So it's always nice to be appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so thanks for that, Sarah. And Tony Gordon says, we buy goods from suppliers in Europe. We buy these products on DAP terms. So are we responsible for customs clearance? Goods are wrapped in plastic packaging. Are we responsible for reporting, or the EU manufacturer?
That again will depend on the detail of those terms, and I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on all the different terms or what exactly that terms involves, but whoever is responsible for getting those goods through customs and who owns them as they clear customs effectively will be responsible for the plastic packaging tax, because they'll be the importer.
Yeah, you're not going into Europe or halfway across the world to collect this tax, are you?
Well, overseas businesses that import goods into the UK are and should register for the tax.
Right.
Because you get a lot of overseas-based businesses are the importers that import goods into the UK to their own warehouses and then sell them, for example. They would be required to register. But if the goods effectively become the importers, if it's a British company importing, and they effectively take ownership once they leave the overseas base of the seller, and the British company is responsible for the import, then they would be the taxpayer.
Excellent. Are you aware of what's going on elsewhere? Is this likely to spread into other parts of Europe? Is there any feel for that at the moment?
There are a few countries around Europe introducing different versions of the tax. It's early days, and a lot of it was postponed because of the pandemic. So we're looking at what's happening. We were the first, I think, but there are others out there now that are in the process of coming in. I think there's an EU directive as well requiring member states to implement some form of plastic packaging tax, but it's left more or less to the individual countries what they do. So yeah, there are things coming in, but nothing exactly the same.
Thanks for that, Mark. And another sort of question I've sort of had up my sleeve is, I know there are third-party organisations that organisations can work with to assemble their numbers really for this, and therefore know how much tax. Have you got any sort of sense of what proportion of organisations already are going to third parties to help them out with things, or are doing it single-handed, doing it on their own?
Shall I come in there, Mark?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think we've obviously got good links with the Packaging Scheme Forum people and compliance forums who do a lot of the PR obligated stuff for businesses. So I think a lot of them have got involved, and businesses are looking to them to help them. Obviously, we've got an agent facility on the returns service, so agents can submit on behalf of businesses. But no, we've not, apart from the compliance forum and a few of the big accountants, not heard a great deal. I think businesses are largely getting on with it themselves, depending on their size.
Excellent, thanks for that. Yeah, it's interesting to sort of follow that, isn't it? Because all of these things develop their own process of technology, and between one organisation and another, it can depend on whether you kind of do it all yourself, or you immediately go out to a third party, or you do that slightly late in the day. But obviously, you're just interested in getting the right numbers in from people and doing it fairly and squarely. So we've got a couple of thank yous there again from Narendra, just saying that you found it all very useful. Thanks for the clarifications. I don't know if there are any further questions from anybody or any closing points. If not, we're able to give everybody 20 minutes of their day back, which is always a bonus. And can I thank yourself, Hilary, and Mark, for giving up your time here. It's immensely useful. People do find this incredibly useful, this stuff, and we do share the stuff afterwards. We put our webinars online, and a lot of people access them in an automated sense as well afterwards. So they get effectively reused. You'll be delighted to hear.
Good. Well, thank you for the invite.
Absolute
Yes,
pleasure.
thank you for
Thank
having
you
us.
both very much.
Okay.